Greetings, everyone. Will and I go way back. We served on ISPI's research together. I think it was in about 2006. Since that time, I've followed his work at Work Learning Research. Over the years, I've used Will's research on how to space practice and learning over time, how to provide learners with feedback, how much learners forget, and how quickly they do it. Tonight, Will is going to share some of his current work with us in terms of problems with traditional end-of-training smile sheets and the performance and how performance-focused smile sheets can replace them, and the origins and limitations of the Kirkpatrick Katzell training evaluation model and an LTEM model that can overcome these limitations. He's also going to talk about how evaluation practices can provide guidance for instructional designers. And he'll also answer your questions. Will, we're delighted to have you with us today. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, Steve. It's a pleasure always to work with you. I was thinking about the little thing we did with Mary Norris Thomas on how to do research, which was good. So let me just get us started by I'm gonna introduce some slides to you, really as conversation starters. Before I even jump into the bulk of my presentation, I'm going to have a question for you. But what I want to sort of introduce this by saying that I'm going to just touch on these things. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go fast so that we have something to talk about. You may find yourself feeling, oh, I wish we could go deeper, and that's fine. I'm really going to leave that depth for you to discover later. But I wanted to get to the discussions because I think they're the most valuable. So let me get my slides up here. All right. So this is the Athena, the god of wisdom, or the goddess of wisdom. And I have a question for you, those in the audience, for James and Valerie. You can answer either of these questions, or you can just reflect on, why you don't feel that you'd like to answer them. But first question, do you have a philosophy or approach to learning evaluation that you embrace? If so, what is it? Or what's the best reasoning you've heard for why we should evaluate learning? So you going to give that a shot? And I know that, there's not that many people in the audience, so, it sort of puts the onus on you, James and Valerie, if you're willing and able.
I'll jump in. I'm going to take question number 2, the best reasoning you've heard for why we should evaluate learning. We're doing that at work, but it's usually used as a performance, part of the performance appraisal system for those of us who train at work. And I kind of feel like there's no real forethought in measuring performance gaps or collecting information that allows us to improve not only training, but the training environment and other things. And so I don't have a best reasoning, but I do know what doesn't work from what I'm experiencing at work.
Okay, great. Thanks, Valerie. James, you want to give it a shot?
I'm okay. I'm just trying to keep the baby quiet. So.
Okay, no worries. Hey, Steve, you want to jump in? Do you have a philosophy or approach?
I think so. I think it's along the lines of trying to measure what it is we're doing as we're creating it, and then afterwards to see if it's doing the things that we thought it was going to do. We tend to try to tie our training to performance gaps and to causes of performance gaps that are related to a lack of skills. And so seeing if we provided training and other solutions that work together in a way to close the gap is the basis for declaring a shared success story.
Great.
And then the best reason is if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will do.
Right. Okay,
You're
good.
quoting the Cheshire Cat.
Yeah. All right. So this is my slide to remind myself to keep things moving, that I'll give myself a yellow card if I don't do that and if I don't get you guys involved. Just thought I'd introduce myself. If you don't know me, Work Learning Research is my research and consulting practice. And what I've tried to do over the years is bridge the gap between the research side and the practice side. I feel like there's wisdom in both camps, but oftentimes we don't talk to each other. We don't have the same language. For 20 years, almost every year, I've read over 200 articles from the scientific journals and translated that research into practical recommendations, which I used in my consulting work, in my speaking, in my learning audits, etc. So one of the things I've done is to publish some of that work on my catalog. It's all there available for free. And I started out just focused on the learning research, but then I got fascinated by the learning evaluation stuff. I wrote an article on it, or a research to practice report, and it really resonated. And I found it sort of fascinating. You know, why don't we just stick to the research? Well, research gives us some good ideas for what to do, but if we're not getting feedback on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, we still may be in the dark about things, and we can still improve things that way. So I think they sort of go hand in hand. We're going to talk about performance-focused smile sheets later and the learning transfer evaluation model, LTEM. We'll jump into those. But first, I want to emphasize, and I do this at the beginning of all my evaluation workshop, that there's no perfect measurement tool. Measuring temperature, miles per hour in learning, no perfect measurement tool. I really like this quote from this new book by Deborah Bandelos. Our measures are not perfect, but they should instead be thought of as approximations. To me, this really tells us that we should have a great deal of humility when we go into evaluating learning. Learning is very complex. You add learning to performance on top of that, more complex. And then you add this measurement stuff on top of that, incredibly complex. So a little bit of humility should do us well. Now, I'm going to go through a series of slides that sort of go through the history of learning evaluation over the decades. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of hand-wringing about, you know, I wish we would do it better. And we'll start out with Donald Kirkpatrick in 1960. He said the evaluation of training programs in terms of results is progressing at a very slow rate. In 1969, the researcher Ronald Burke said, for the most part, the benefits of industrial training have been taken on faith. Few demands have been made to evaluate it in a rigorous manner. Brinkerhoff, evaluation guru, said, with some notable exceptions, relatively little work has been devoted to making evaluation more useful and worthwhile. ASTD, now ATD, said, our research revealed that actual practice of evaluation doesn't often follow the strict recommendations of evaluation literature. That was in 1990. This was in 2007 with some work that I did with the e-learning guild. And we found in this question that only 20% of people responded, said they were able to do the learning measurement they wanted to do. Josh Burson, industry analyst, said in 2008, in every year for the past 3 years, more than 90% rated measurement as the number 1 or number 2 area they would like to improve. So you can see there's a lot of angst. And this was last year. This is Towards Maturity, their UK group, but they did a global research survey of L&D leaders, and 97% wanted to improve the way they gathered and analyzed data on learning impact. 97%, that's like everybody, except for a few. This is some research that I just did, and this is about learner surveys or smile sheets, and you can see you know, a lot of people say our data is not very useful or it's somewhat useful. Only about 15% said it was very useful. And then some research I'm doing right now with the Guild. We haven't released this yet, so you will be the first people to see this. We asked people, are you able to do the learning measurement you want to? 52% said, no, I wish we could substantially change what we're doing now. And even those on the happy side, so I'm mostly happy, but would like to make improvements. Only 13% were fully happy. So you can see there's this trend over the years. So it shows that there's lots of room for improvement and that it's a difficult thing to do. So when we start talking about evaluation, we have to talk about the 4-level model. And some of you might have heard that some of us are now calling it the Kirkpatrick Katzell 4-level model, because it turns out that Raymond Katzell was actually the originator of the 4-level idea, and you can read more about that there if you want. What I'm going to do now is jump into the performance-focused smile sheets. We're at the level 1 reaction level in the Kirkpatrick Katzell model. And my first question to you is, what do you think of them? You know, there's no perfect measurement, so let's be, you know, not too harsh. But how would you rate the typical learner feedback questions that you've seen? And I'll give you 2 negative ones and 2 positive ones. So, and you can why don't we just use the chat for this, and you can put a number in there, or okay. I don't know if James is able to type. He's got a little package of joy in his arms. So, all right. So, what I usually say here, you know, with the bigger audience, people are all over the place, and I say, look, if you're on the negative side, I'll give you some ideas. You might be able to make yours better. If you're on the positive side, I'm probably going to challenge some of your views about how well you're doing. All right, so with that as a backdrop, let's jump into the research. There's been 2 meta-analyses done on smile sheets, and they correlated smile sheets with learning results, and they found correlation, an R of 0.09. And if you remember from your statistics, anything below 0.30 is considered a weak correlation. So 0.09 is virtually no correlation at all. Now what this means from a practical standpoint is that if you get high marks in your smile sheets, you can have a very effective course or a very ineffective course. If you get low marks, you can have a poorly designed course or a well-designed course. With traditional smile sheets, you really just can't tell. And when I first saw this data, I said, whoa, what's the implication? Maybe we should just get rid of them. And then I realized, well, organizations are going to use them anyway, right? They're traditional. They do give us some good feedback about how well people like it, and that's important. If we have a bad reputation, we're not going to go far in our learning. We'll probably get fired, in fact. So it's important to do that. So then the question becomes, if we're not going to get rid of them, can we make them better? And my answer was yes. We're probably not going to make them perfect, but we can make them better. So let's dive in a little bit as to what some of the problems are. One of the problems is that we use Likert-like scales. I used to say Likert, but I've learned recently that it's Likert. So we give a statement, and then people say strongly agree, etc. We put a number onto that. We take an average. Well, as Sharon Schrock and Bill Coscarelli have told us, the resulting scale is deficient in that the response words are open to many interpretations. So strongly agree, they're too fuzzy. And actually taking this nominal data and putting a number on it, making it ordinal or interval data is considered illegal by mathematicians, statisticians. So we have that problem as well. So that's one issue. Another issue is that we're asking our learners to make assessments of their own learning. And yet research shows that learners don't always know their own learning. So to rely on them entirely without constraint is a little bit problematic. So when we think we should be sort of learner-centric, that's an issue. Doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to our learners, but we need to make sure that we're asking questions they can answer and asking them in a way that doesn't bias them. So we'll now talk about what a performance-focused smile sheet looks like, why it's different. One of the things before we get into that is I want to emphasize that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of great research that's been done, the science of learning stuff, as evidence in these books, as evidence in really good research reviews in the literature, and as evidence in the sort of research to practice folks, the stuff that I do, Patty Shank, Julie Dirksen, Clark Quinn, Carl Kopp, and others. Really great stuff. We should obviously use this in our learning designs, but also in thinking about evaluation as well. So in a nutshell, and the 9 items I'm hiding are from the book. Really, I based this and modified it based on the work of Rob Brinkerhoff. But there's really 3 reasons to do smile sheets. 1, to get a sense of the effectiveness of the learning. 1, to support our learners in learning. And 1 is about the reputation of the learning, the satisfaction of the learners. Traditional smile sheets focus on the reputation. Nobody really focuses too much on supporting learners. And the thing that I'm trying to do is get us to focus a bit more on the effectiveness of the learning. So what does a smile sheet question, a performance-focused smile sheet question look like? Here's one. How able are you to put what you've learned into practice on the job? And I'll just let you read through those. And I like this question for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's focused on something that's important on the job performance. And number 2, there's granularity between the answer choices. No longer are we choosing between strongly agree and agree. We're choosing between items that people can really wrap their heads around. This has several advantages. 1, the learners who are responding are able to think more clearly, more precisely about their answer. So the data we're getting is starts out more precise. And then it has the advantage of also being able to report out in a way that is much less fuzzy than a 4.1. My course is a 4.1. Most responses come in between 3.8 and 4.5. There's no differentiation there. When there's no differentiation, then there's no decisions that you can make. You don't know what to do. There's no urgency, there's no clarity. So we can get data from this kind of question that looks like this, right? So, oh my gosh, I've developed awareness, but I need more guidance or training or coaching. Well, then the training is probably not good enough. Whereas, maybe if I just need more experience, that is acceptable. You can see how this gives us much more clarity about the results than that number that comes from fuzzy data. Here's another one. After the course, when you begin to apply your new knowledge at your work site, which of the following supports are likely to be in place for you? Select as many items that are likely to be true. I'll let you skim through those. But you can see these are much more anchored in concrete experience. So I will have my progress monitored by my supervisor, someone to coach or mentor me. I will have access to a course instructor, job aids, periodically reminded. Okay? It's much easier for the learner to wrap their head around the choices, to give us data that is more meaningful. Also, this is focused on something that's important. We know from the research on learning transfer that after training follow-through is critical. So again, it meets that criteria as well. So you might say, well, wait a minute, Will, these questions are a lot different than the typical ones. Won't people dislike them? My argument's always been, are you kidding me? I mean, do you really think when people look at your Likert-like scale, your numeric scale, that they get jazzed up? And, to me, it's like crazy. Like, they know that we're getting data that's not that meaningful when we circle their numbers. We have these choices now that are more meaningful. I think people pay more attention to them. So we asked this question, did a pilot in 2 different organizations, one a for-profit, one a not-for-profit organization, 20 different courses, different types of training, and the results were these. 90% of the learners said they liked the new questions equal to better of the old type. 80% liked the new questions better. Only 10% liked the old kind of questions better. So clearly learners tend to like these. So I always emphasize, I emphasize this in the book, that this smile sheets are not the only thing we should be doing. In fact, you'll see when we get to the LTEM model that smile sheets are at level or tier 3, and it's not even in the green area, which is the good area. So even though I'm like the guy that wrote the book on performance-focused smile sheets in the LTEM model, I put them down toward the bottom because they're not something we should rely on completely. All right, so I've used these for e-learning, conference evaluations forum, self-study learning programs, even somebody had me do an employee exit survey. So they can be used in lots of different kind of things. What, oh, just ignore this, just ignore this part down here. What questions do you have? And we can do this in the chat if you want, or you can just turn off your mic and ask a question. And as you're thinking about that, I'll say that when I teach a workshop on this, I get a lot of questions because people want to know the nuts and bolts of this. So I know I'm just giving you, a quick introduction today, but I'm willing to take your questions if you have any.
Yeah, one question I have is, in my experience, most managers and executives really could care less about the average smile sheet and whether or not people really like the training or want to recommend it to a friend. One of the things that struck me is the slide you showed about the transfer training, the transfer support. Is that something that you've taken to leadership and had their buy-in in terms of, they have follow-up transfer responsibilities?
Yes. Well, some of my clients are experimenting with that. And I think the jury's still out. And oftentimes people buy the book, they put up the questions, and I never hear from them. And I've been asking this, and maybe one of your students would like to do this, but I want to do more research on these. Several people are starting to do research on LTEM and do their dissertations on it. I just got a company who said, Will, we want to do research, so we just started that. But there are some great questions like that that are out there. I think it's a real opportunity. Oftentimes we do training in an isolated silo. And, it's hard to get management to support, their direct reports who are doing training. But if we can nudge them in that direction, sort of using the behavioral economist notions of nudging, so it doesn't feel like it's a bad thing that they want to do it, then I think, everybody's going to benefit from that. They're going to benefit because their workers are going to get up to speed more quickly, and the organization's going to benefit. The person's going to benefit because they're performing better in their job if they get coached and, encouraged and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things I talk about in terms of our smile sheet questions is we can use them to send messages. So I didn't really delve into that side of it tonight, but that question we asked about after training follow-through, a lot of people have never thought about that. Well, what do you mean? I'm just giving a training. Well, now if we ask a question about it, everybody looks at it and goes, oh, maybe we should do something. So, it's not, again, it's not like aiming for perfection. It's like aiming for improvement. And if we can get a few more people thinking, well, hey, I'm the supervisor or my manager, they could help me. Maybe I'll ask for help. Or or you're the trainer and you see a question about, oh, will they have access to me after the course? I never thought of that. Why don't I start a group? Anybody who wants support afterwards? I used to be a leadership trainer, and I look back on some of what I did fondly and proudly, and some of what I did was terrible. And one of the terrible things was I would go out, I'd give a training, and then I would never see those people again. that's like malpractice, right? I didn't know if they were hitting obstacles. I didn't know, maybe I could have been there for them, supported them. Maybe I could have learned what was working and what wasn't working. So, you know, if we can ask questions that get us as the learning professionals and get the learners and get the, you know, the business ecosystem there to think about things that they wouldn't have thought about. Wow, what power is that? Okay. Any other questions? All right, let's go on. I'm gonna ask you a question here. What do you think of this one? This is a smile sheet question, and I don't want you to answer the question. I want you to tell us whether you think it's good, okay, or bad. And just do this quickly in the chat, and then I'll report out what you say. All right, so you guys don't like it. Yeah, it's got a Likert scale, and so naturally it's got that fuzziness to it. So it's a problem. Now, having clear expectations, that's not a bad thing. It's probably a better way to answer that one. So what's wrong?
When you answered those questions, one thing I saw in your scaling is that you're using a one-directional scale that starts with nothing and then builds up to an everything.
Yeah.
Which is neat because, you know, people are going to fall somewhere within that continuum, and it's a meaningful continuum.
Yeah, and one of the tricks there, I don't know if the ones I showed you sort of spell this out. I think one of them did, but oftentimes people feel they should always circle the top one or the strongest one, and I want people to slow down and not do that. So sometimes my top choice is sort of over the top. I'm going to be an expert in this because I don't want them to choose that, and I want them to really think about it. There's a sort of a little bit of an art to that. All right, so this one's got a problem. What do you think it is? I should say it could have many problems, but what's wrong with it? Valerie, James, what do you think?
Well, I don't know in a training environment whether the participants will know whether their manager will discuss their learning activity. That's
Okay.
number one. Number two, the scale is going to be similar to what you've just discussed with the Likert scale.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, these numeric scales are even worse. They're even fuzzier, right? So that's the big problem with this. It could be, depending on the type of training, that this would set expectations too high. But I kind of like that notion. We know that it's probably the number one thing in the transfer literature, that if managers are supportive and do follow-up, that the learning is more likely to transfer. So we might rewrite this question something like this. What plans, if any, do you have for talking with your manager in the next 10 days about how you will use the learning in your work?
Yeah, I like that much better. In fact, I like all of the questions you've presented from performance-focused questions.
Great. So you can see, again, this kind of question sends a message to everybody involved that, hey, you know, maybe my manager should be involved, or maybe I, as the manager, when I see the report that comes back, maybe I should have been more involved. And then we can start thinking about how we can make that work. All right, let's go on to LTEM, Learning Transfer Evaluation Model. You know, one question, why do we need a new evaluation model? Well, you remember I went through the decades and we saw that there's a lot of frustration out there. We don't think we're doing it. Well, that's one reason. Another reason is the dominant model that we're using, the Kirkpatrick model, has some flaws. Since my voice is going, I'm going to not read this, but you can read this for yourself, and it's pretty damning. So,
and it's funny, Jim Kirkpatrick did a webinar for this course, and you know, in both his book and Jack Phillips' book, they tell you that you're supposed to work the levels in reverse order. So you're supposed to start at the beginning of a project with the level 4, the estimated or anticipated level 4, and then how are we going to see that on the job? And finally, at the end, you know, level 1 is, you know, a cover your bases kind of thing. And, you know, he kind of groaned And, because that is their advice. It's just there's a widespread belief that somehow or another you're going to start with level 1 and work your way up. And the rate for, the rate for going from level 2 to level 3 is really low. And even fewer people are able to go to a level 4 or 5 depending on your model.
Yeah. Well, and one of the reasons I developed the LTEM, or one of the philosophies behind it, is that our models send messages. And the way the Kirkpatrick model is laid out, 1, 2, 3, 4, sends a message. Start with 1, go to 4. So that's not a great message. Now, I'm going to cover some good messaging from the Kirkpatrick model, because it's not all bad, obviously. But a lot of us, because we swam in this ocean for so long, we don't even think that maybe it's not it's not perfection. So, in fact, that's my next slide. You can see the subtitle of the report that goes with the model, which is 34 pages, by the way, highly recommended. Sending messages to enable learning effectiveness. So let's think about ADDIE. We all know ADDIE. What messages does it send? Well, it sends some good ones and some not so helpful ones. So a good message that it sends is do some serious assessment in the beginning and do some serious evaluation. Those are good messages. But one of the problems with one of the bad messages is that it sort of puts evaluation at the end. And really, you should be assessing during design and development and implementation, during all these things. It also sends a message that it's a start to finish kind of model. Really, it should be iterative, right? So it's got some good messaging and it's got some messaging that's not so helpful. And this messaging is important because it nudges us in certain directions. So I just wanted to use that as an example. The question then is, what are messages that the 4-level model send? Well, I'm going to go through a few real quickly. So some beneficial messages. Don't just focus on learning, focus on results too. Probably the most important beneficial message that the model sends. And I would argue, and I have argued, that you think back in the history of our field, we started to be learning focused, training focused, classroom focused, and gradually over time, particularly with the help of ISPI, we really moved from that classroom focus, that learning focus, to a performance focus. And the fact that the Kirkpatrick model was so dominant really supported us in this, because that's sort of one of the messages that it sent. Another important message it sends: learner opinions are not most important. It puts them at level 1, clearly not most important. So some harmful messages that were sent or missed being sent. One, it does not warn us against ineffective evaluation practices. So we often measure a number of butts and seats, course completion rates. It's sort of silent on those. And that's too bad, because a lot of us keep doing those bad things. It ignores the role of remembering. We know people don't just need to comprehend, they need to be able to remember. It puts all learning in the bucket 2, and it doesn't differentiate between comprehension and remembering. And in fact, learning, one of the biggest problems with the model is it mashes all learning into this level 2 bucket. So learning can be measured by having us regurgitate trivial information. Okay, not so helpful. It can be like meaningful decision making. It can be actually showing that you can do the task. Those are all measures of learning, and yet they're put into one bucket. And so when we go to do an analysis based on the 4-level model, we tend to do a checklist. Well, let's just ask them some simple questions. Well, yeah, but then we're not really getting at the most important aspects of learning. So just a brief, this model, I worked on it for like a year or so, did many different versions. You can see there was a 15-level version. Now it's 8 tiers. I call them tiers so to distinguish it between levels. I'll go through these. But first I wanted to, in the report, I thank people especially for helping out. I also took this to an ISPI conference, got feedback from the audience there. That was very helpful. I took it to London, got feedback there at the Learning Technologies Conference. So here it is. Tier 1 is attendance. Learner signs up, starts, attends, or completes the learning experience. And notice, this is a metric that's inadequate to validate learning success because learners may attend but not learn. And you can see this is in red, sort of indicating that there's danger there. I know that's not culturally global, but that's what it is right now. Activity, tier 2, learner engages in measures of attention or interest or participation. People can do all these things. They can have attention, they can show interest, they can participate, but it's inadequate to validate learning success because learners may do these things but not learn. Tier 3, we already talked about this, is learner perceptions. We've got 3A is learners are queried in a way that reveals insights related to learning effectiveness. And tier B is learners queried in ways that does not reveal insights on learning effectiveness. This is really learner satisfaction, course reputation. Knowledge. And note here that knowledge is based or really divided into two areas, which really gets at that understanding, remembering distinction. So knowledge recitation is during or right after a learning event. Knowledge retention is after several days or more. So this sort of indicates, remembering. And notice that even that is usually inadequate because remembering terminology does not fully enable performance, right? You can know the definitions but not be able to do anything. So now we get into the top 5 tiers. Decision-making competence. This also has the distinction between understanding and remembering. And there's decision-making competence during or right after, and remember decision-making competence. This is the first tier where we're going to certify something related to the possibility of transfer. So we'll certify that you have decision-making competence here. Task competence. So decision-making competence is I know what to do, and task competence is not only do I know what to do, but I can actually do it. I like to use my experience as a leadership trainer and developing leadership simulations. I can give somebody a scenario, a simulation scenario, and they can tell me what the right thing to do is. But as a real leader, they need to use the right body language, the right tone of voice, use the right words. So there's a distinction there. They may be able to make the decision, but not be able to fully process it out. Okay, and again, this has the understanding and remembering distinction. So tier 7 is transfer. Can you perform work tasks successfully? And tier 8 is actually the effects of transfer. And note here that we're really talking about effects that affect learners or coworkers, family, friends, or the organization or the community, the society, and the environs. For those of you who follow Roger Kaufman's work, I was glad to hear that he liked the fact that mega wasn't, as part of the model. So, all right, so let me just make one more distinction here. Tier 7 and 8 are work performance. Tier 6, 5, and below are performance in learning. Okay, that's important. So everybody wants to know, how does this compare to the Kirkpatrick Katzell 4-level model? So tier 3 is level 1 reaction, although we have a distinction there of two levels. Level 2 learning is 4, 5, and 6. Level 3 is tier 7. Level 4 is results. Now there's some specificity in here that's not included, obviously, in the 4 levels, but fairly straightforward. And then how do you use LTEM? Well, there's 2 ways, really. Number one, we can sort of use it as a map and assess where we are in our organization. So let's say we're doing traditional smile sheets and we're measuring attendance. So we can look at where we are and say, oh, okay, well, all right, maybe later this year, we'll add performance-focused smile sheets and we'll use some scenario-based decisions. 2019, we'll measure transfer on some of our strategically important courses. 2020, we'll start measuring the effects of transfer. So you can use it that way, fairly simple, just to say, real quick, oh, where are we? Where could we be going? I guess you could call that a gap analysis. The second way, learning, design, and development, working backwards from your goals. And, a lot of us evaluation folks talk this way. But this is really, it's not so much evaluation, it's really project management for our development process. So if we want our sales to increase by 5%, Okay, that's our ultimate goal. And we know that maybe coaching, we think it's going to be really important. We've done our due diligence. We've done that, our ADDIE assessment. And we think if our managers coach better. And so we actually have a diagnostic we're going to use here to measure transfer. The Delta coaching diagnostic. I'm making that up, by the way, but you can imagine somebody has one. And then during the learning, we're going to use some rubrics. So when people simulate coaching, we can evaluate how well they're doing. We can give them feedback, but we can also evaluate our performance in getting them up to speed. We have some scenario-based questions they can use. In knowledge, maybe coaching, there's certain types of coaching situations and coaching. So if there's this coaching situation, I'm going to use this coaching methodology, et cetera. We can test their knowledge on that, and then we can use some performance-focused smile sheets. Now, we can use some of these other measures, and I'm not saying never to use these. What I am saying is these don't validate success. You might really want to know about their attention from a formative evaluation standpoint, but not to validate that we've created learning. So that's it in a nutshell, fairly straightforward. What questions do you have about LTEM?
Oh, I like the selection of the night.
You got to have fun.
There's a distinction you're making between knowledge of and remembering. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Sure. This is an insight I had a few years ago, but we get somebody to learn something. We know if we study human memory that memories fade, right? We also know that there's some learning practices that will minimize the forgetting curve or make it less steep. So for example, retrieval practice, context alignment, spacing effect. We know these three things, and you put the first two things together, the way normal people talk about that is giving people a realistic practice. So realistic practice and spacing, we put those things. We know that if we have that in our training design, people will forget less of what we teach them. So it's not enough to get people to understand and comprehend. We need to also help them remember. Now, there's a complicating factor here is we could use job aids and performance support, but when we do need to get them to remember, this distinction between comprehension and remembering is really critical. So if it's critical from a design standpoint, it's equally critical from a measurement standpoint. And so I could create a great course that if I give people a test right afterwards, they're going to do well. Or if I ask them to actually do the skill, they could do well. But if they can't do it a week later, then I have not performed as well as I could have as an instructional designer, as a trainer. I've seen this in practice. So I do learning audits, and I've done learning audits of like IT training. And you get a really good IT trainer, and they're up in the front of the room, and they go around, they help people, and at the end of the course, people are, oh, I got this. I know how to use the software now. And they feel like they know it, and they leave. And then, if you ask them a few days later, how's it going? They'll tell you stuff. And I've got quotes like this from real people saying, when I was in the classroom, I was comfortable. I thought I knew it. And I come back here, and I can't remember anything. I wish there was somebody here to help me out. And so that distinction is real, and it's important. And if we only measure for comprehension and not remembering, we are fooling ourselves. We're getting better results than we deserve.
Couldn't agree more with all of that. I think I couldn't agree more with all of that. It frustrates me how that isn't more commonplace in all of learning. Not just workplace learning, which it seems to not be there, but in college and throughout traditional education as well.
Absolutely. And, there's a real bias because let's say you're a teacher or a trainer, you're up in front of the room. And if you're a good one, you're monitoring comprehension by looking in people's eyes. And the learners, remember we know that learners don't always know their own learning. So they are looking at the content. They feel they have it. In fact, if you gave them extra practice at that moment, they would reject it because they feel they have it. But I, as the trainer, I'm looking out there. They're all comfortable. They're confident. I'm feeling like I've done my job, but I haven't really done my job because it's sort of a false sense of, the power of learning, because I may not have prepared them for that interim, for the retention interval, to support their remembering. But you're right. It's one of the things that I'm delighted to be able to get as a connotation into the LTEM model is this distinction between understanding and remembering.
And I think it may be more than remembering. I saw an interesting session at AECT with a PhD nurse candidate who was talking about training hospital personnel on basic life support, including CPR. And one of the things about CPR is at the end of that training, you're going to walk away being able to do it at the appropriate cadence, the right number of beats per minute. Interestingly, that's one of the first things that decays. And so she was illustrating a iPad game where you're essentially tapping the iPad, to reestablish that cadence. And
that's nice.
Yeah, it's really slick. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And so it's not necessarily remembering, it's maintaining a skill that quickly decays. And there are different ways to do that.
Yeah, and I've been using the word remembering as opposed to retrieval, which the researchers use.
Yeah.
Because it's more colloquial. Unfortunately, it has a connotation of conscious, intentional retrieval, right? And I mean it more globally. It's really about, will I be able to, given the cues in my environment, will I be triggered in the right way to do the right things? But all that is what I mean by remembering.
See, that's a neat distinction because, remember, could almost be taken as, all life is a knowledge test.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah. That's good. That's good. And you pointed out something else, which is that there's, remembering what to do, but there's also remembering that I may need a performance support tool to use, or I may need to remember that there is a knowledge repository that I can go to, right? I mean, there's all those complications as well, but in some sense, it's all the same thing. If we, that's, like IT training, going back to that, we should be teaching IT training to encourage people to use the support systems they're going to have to use on the job, right? If it's a paper manual, bring the manual into the classroom and have them use it. If it's an online support, give them a problem and don't have them ask me, the teacher. Well, you do that at first, but by the end of the course, you say, okay, use the tools, the help system, search Google, whatever you need to do. What are you going to, so, memory is really fascinating. So,
and I love that operational definition of given the cues, are you have you decided to do the right thing and executed it the right way?
Right. Absolutely. Well,
because the other thing about that's really an interesting implication of this model is that you can't just it's the end of the training event. I am done. You know, it's how in the design you put in place these mechanisms that will facilitate retrieval back in the workplace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it also may push us toward training that is not just a single one-time event as well. Right? And there's, you know, I talked about subscription learning, this notion of little nuggets over time, but you can imagine that people don't like quizzes and tests that are sort of glommed on to the end, right? I'm sure that's not true for your students. But, you know, but imagine if you give them a challenge that's related to the learning. And for them, it's a learning experience. And for you, it's an evaluation experience, right? So, you know, they access my learning on Saturday. They come back on Wednesday. I give them some challenge tests. So for them, they're learning on Wednesday. For me, I'm evaluating my Saturday performance. Yeah. So, all right. So I know you guys are focusing on Merrill's first principles, and I grabbed a image from online that was cited in reference to Merrill's first principles. So the question that we have for you is, what, if anything, have you learned in this session that you might want to apply to your ID projects? So I know there's only two of you, so it really puts you on the spot here. But
And speaking about glomming questions and quizzes on the end of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, as we're contemplating this, I just want to point out that I'm in the Boston area, and you know, this is Fenway Park, and we just won the World Series, so we're sort of in a happy mood here. So that's where the hat and everything comes from. Because I know people will be looking at this in posterity, and they'll wonder, what the heck was he doing? So
I kind of figured that out.
Thanks,
Remember,
Valerie.
you're coming to Braves country, and we're in mourning a little bit. So when you come into Atlanta this week, you know, you'll have to tone it down just a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Sitting here trying to think through this, surprisingly, I got stopped by HR today in the parking lot about our evaluation and program assessment. And they wanted to have a collaborative discussion. So I had a lot of light bulbs tonight. It's a little late, but I had a lot of light bulbs. And I want to explore your information a lot more now. I don't think we do a good job in either end of assessing whether our learners are learning. And this definitely opens my eyes a lot more. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So
Congratulations too.
oh, thank you very much. I had a lot to do with it.
Okay.
All right. So here's some links if you guys are interested. Steve will get these up here. I'll send you the slides, Steve, and then people can get the PDF, and they can actually just click on these and get them if they want. But there's a lot of information if you're interested in going deeper. You can give your Smilesheet a checkup. Smilesheets.com is where that one book is. And I love to hear from people, so feel free to get in touch with me as well.
Will, thank you.
Well, you're welcome, Steve. Anytime.
What a gift.
Thanks, James and Valerie, for joining us. And for those of you who are listening to the recording, we'll say hi as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I guess this concludes our webinar. Will, thanks again.
Thanks,
and
Steve.
I'm glad to see that you're doing webinars direct from Fenway.
Yeah, right. It's amazing, right?
Green screens are amazing.
They are.
All right. Good night, all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.